Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hello, everyone, and we're glad you can attend Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts webinar. We hope that everyone is staying safe and staying well. Just some housekeeping before we get started. If you've listened to one of our webinars before, you know we offer attendees a certificate of attendance. When the webinar ends, a post-event survey will pop up. It will list 3 questions about the quality of the webinar, followed by 3 questions titled Required for Certificate. If you would like a certificate of attendance emailed to you, you should answer those 3 questions. If you don't want a certificate, obviously don't bother answering them. So today's topic addresses why we are struggling so much, being so hard on ourselves while staying at home. When we were asked to stay at home 2 months ago or so, we thought that this might be a good opportunity to catch up on things, tackle decluttering projects, put in the spring flowers, get to papers in the back of the closet we were meaning to get to. But things haven't worked out that way. Getting through the day with all the stress and uncertainty is tough enough. I know we've received lots of email from readers saying that they feel so drained at the end of the day, and not because they've been plowing through their to-do list. It's just a general fatigue. So what can we do about the fatigue and feelings of listlessness? What's actually going on? Thankfully, we have Michelle Frang to help us navigate these challenges. Michelle is a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in providing diagnostic and treatment services to individuals with the ADHD. She is co-author, along with fellow ADHD expert Sari Solden, of the book A Radical Guide for Women with ADHD, Embrace Neurodiversity, Live Boldly, and Break Through Barriers. You can ask questions of Michelle during her presentation, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can after she finishes. If you want to download the slides of the webinar, click the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources on the bottom left of your screen. If you do not see the Event Resources tab, you need to refresh the page. That all being said, let's finally get to the webinar. Thanks for being here today, Michelle. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your week to spend with me here. I've been talking a lot lately about this topic because I don't know about you, but I've been seeing a lot of messaging, a lot of posting about productivity. And it seemed very ironic to me that in the midst of a global pandemic, it seems like the productivity shaming has gotten even more out of control. And certainly this is something that women with ADHD, people with ADHD are not strangers to. But it does come with an added layer of pain for us. And in this time when everything is shutting down, it seems very odd to me that we're also experiencing this messaging around doubling down on productivity, on production and consumption, and finding our worth based in achievement, when it seems to me this is as good a time as any to start finding worth and value in ourselves in other ways, and to spend this time connecting more with ourselves and our families and coping as best we can. And certainly for some people, that means baking sourdough or, taking up TRX. And that's great. Write that novel, do it. If that's how you cope, if that's what lights you up. But it's important to remember that for a lot of people right now, surviving is actually more of the focus. And I'm going to talk about why that is on a physiological and psychological level in a minute. But, we're not having a real conversation unless we first acknowledge the legacy of shame burden that we bear as women with ADHD that many of us do a lot of work on, and we talk about it and we're aware of it. But the truth is, it's hard to escape it fully when we live in a culture where, neurodivergence isn't exactly celebrated, where our brains work in ways that present real difficulties some days. And so it's this burden that we bear, and one that, I don't know about you, but I find myself continually doing the work of untangling. And so I want to give you this reminder because I think it helps. This is a quote from mine and Sarah's book, Radical Guide for Women with ADHD. And it reads, during the course of our lifetime, we as women with ADHD learn through various channels the way we think, work, speak, relate, and act does not match up with the preferred way of being in the world. In short, we learn that difference is bad. And because we know that we are different, many of us also come to believe that we are bad. And I'm hearing this come up for a lot of people lately. The comparison to what other people are doing, the shoulding of ourselves, even to our own expectations of what ideal coping should look like, leads down this slippery slope to we are bad. I am bad. I'm not good enough. And we get these messages in various ways. We get them directly. So, you're so careless. You're late. You're always late. You're just lazy. You don't try hard enough. We get them through they messages when people are talking about other folks around us. So, have you seen Susie's desk? Woof, right? I'm not having that person in my house for dinner, right? What are they going to say about my living room? Dumb messages are my absolute favorite. And they typically go something like, well, have you just tried using a planner? What about exercise? Maybe you're not exercising enough. What about omega-3s? Have you tried going gluten-free? Do you have reminder apps? Because I really find those helpful, right? Sarah and I call those dumb messages, and we have a lot of fun playing with those. Like, as if I never thought of that, Sharon. I never thought maybe I should set a reminder or use a calendar. Thank you. My entire life has been solved, right? They're well-meaning messages, but they still sting, and they definitely add up over time. They communicate a sense of, I need to fix you, and I don't hear you. And the fourth one, I find we're getting a lot of right now, and that's absorbed messages. This is media. This is workplace, just like culture, things that are more implicit. And, the news cycle, especially with the COVID stuff, has been really round the clock. And because of that, it seems that our exposure to media is, more intense than ever. And so we're getting exposure to all of these messages about how we should be dealing with this. And the truth is, there isn't one perfect way to deal with what is essentially a global community trauma. Before I get into talking about ADHD and the stress response and how that, has anything to do with COVID and all of the shoulds, I want to actually speak on a few key cultural and contextual considerations that they really underlie a lot of my work and what I talk about, but I really want to commit to start saying them out loud because I think they're validating and I think they're really important. These are like cultural truths that are they're systemic forces that really permeate the world we inhabit and certainly our inner lived experiences as women with ADHD. And I think they're important to talk about. So the first one, this should animate. Blaine, it's not animating. Do we know how to do that? There we go. Sorry. The first is that we live in a society where neurotypical patterns of behavior are considered normal. So if neurotypical is considered normal, and I, as someone with ADHD, who's neurodivergent, isn't normal, quote unquote, then what am I? We're up against a lot of messaging about what that means. And it's not always stated explicitly, but it sure as heck is implicitly. And oftentimes our brains go to a place of less than. That's somehow normal, and by that we really just mean the middle of that bell curve, that somehow that is better, which leads us to our second one, that neurotypical behaviors are idealized. It's not just considered normal, but they're actually considered a gold standard. They're held in very high regard. Linearity, very neurotypical ways of being in the world. And so those of us, again, who are neurodivergent are left wondering, well, if I can't live up to that, then what does that mean about me? And oftentimes in our head, that can go to a really negative place, that it means something bad if we're not conscious and vigilant about that messaging inside of ourselves. But I found, too, that ADHDers tend to idealize neurotypicality and really minimize even the struggles that people who are neurotypical have. It's sort of like, just the grass is always greener, only a little bit different, because we really truly believe that like their grass is completely green and ours is burnt to heck, and we live in drought zone and we're never going to be green, and theirs is lush and beautiful rainforest, right? It's not accurate at all, but we tend to fantasize and idealize and hold that in our mind's eye. And that really gets in the way then when we're appraising our own behavior. Another important point, because we're going to talk about comparison today, is that social comparison or social referencing is innate. It's ingrained in us evolutionarily for survival. It made a lot of sense for us to reference the group and say, everybody else is running, there's a fire coming, or we're in danger, I need to hop to it. The thing is, research has also found that we are notoriously terrible at being accurate in our appraisals of ourselves, and especially our comparisons of our own traits or behaviors compared to other people. And that's true whether the behavior is, something that's desirable or not desirable. We're just really bad at making those assessments. So while I think it's important to recognize, I'm going to compare myself, that is sort of where our brains go, it's also really important to remember we are really bad at that. But oftentimes we're left asking, if I don't match up, if I really do feel like I'm an outsider, then how is that okay? In any cultural system or social group, minorities are expected to fit the mold, not the other way around. Minorities are expected to assimilate, to lose part of their identity in order to fit the mold. Can you imagine a world where people were trying harder to be neurodivergent, to act more like their ADHD friends? It's hard to even conceptualize, isn't it? Because the mold is so strong. And a lot of people with ADHD tend to ask themselves, like, I'm doing it as best I can. I'm trying really hard to fit this mold, and I still don't, right? Because they're judging themselves based on being able to pass for neurotypical. And then later on their journey, there tends to come the second level of questioning. What if I stop trying? What if I break out of the mold? What does that mean? But then we're stuck with this problem that ADHD symptoms really can impair functioning. It's important to be strengths-based, but it's also important to honor that this is a chronic brain-based condition that can really get in the way of having relationships, having a job, having financial success, getting through the day, if it's not diagnosed and managed well. So I often get some pushback when I talk about acceptance, because there's this fear, if I accept it, then am I letting go? Is that complacency? How can I accept something that actually impairs my functioning? And so anytime I talk about acceptance, I want to clarify, I'm not talking about complacency. It's really two tracks. Yes, we absolutely need to be working on the skills and strategies that support our brain-based differences. We'll talk about some of those today. But it's also important to lean into the acceptance piece, to educate ourselves. How does the ADHD brain work? What is unique about it? And since it's the brain I've got, how can I live with it? And the last consideration, and is really important for me to speak on, is that, this, as the saying has been going around lately, we are in the same storm, but we are not in the same boat. That all of the challenges we talk about with ADHD are compounded for women with ADHD who are also women of color, who are LGBTQ, who have class differences or differently abled bodies. This is intersectionality. And so the more different, the different levels of discrimination you experience out in the world every day, obviously those compound exponentially. And I just want to honor that complexity before we move forward and honor that everyone's experience, especially right now, is a bit different. So now let's get into ADHD and COVID and stress, as if I really need to tell you, because I know you feel this in your bones. And I want to preface it again by saying everybody experiences ADHD and stress, and especially COVID stress, very uniquely. Some people right now are finding that they feel relieved. Some of the pressure is off, or they're finding themselves feeling activated by the anxiety. They're able to start and get things done. And so all of the chaos and the intensity of what's going on out in the world is kind of serving as a dopamine and norepinephrine stimulator in a way. It's the adrenaline is keeping them going. And yet other people are really back to that familiar feeling of treading water just to get by, just to stay afloat. And that the scales have really tipped for them in terms of their ability to cope and the demands, on their resources. So let's talk a bit about the ADHD brain and some of those intersections. The first is that the ADHD brain struggles with emotional regulation. People with ADHD are easily flooded, tend to be highly emotional, low frustration tolerance. And that isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes that's of benefit. But it's also overwhelming, and it can be uncomfortable. And if we're not coping well with it, it can definitely get in the way. And right now we're in a period of heightened emotions anyways. So if you feel all up in your feelings right now, that is totally to be expected. I'm seeing a lot of increased anxiety, seeing a lot of increased issues around regulating mood and depression. I'm seeing loneliness. I am hearing a lot of struggles around body image and food. We put a lot of on our body, right? So some of it's coming out that way. A lot of feelings happening. The second piece is that the ADHD brain already struggles to regulate arousal states. If you look at brain scans, sometimes the ADHD brain is hyper-aroused, sometimes it's hypo-aroused. And actually, this is why people with ADHD fall asleep when they're bored or understimulated. It's not about fatigue. It's about alertness and arousal pathways not being properly regulated. So falling asleep in class, long drives, right? I know a lot of people with ADHD can't drive very long distances because of this. So we struggle already to put our foot on the gas and then put our foot on the brakes and then do that dance between the two and make our lives move. On a daily basis, it's already somewhat challenging. But it's certainly even more challenging right now when we're in this like vortex, right, where there is an external structure. And we could really use the ability to start and stop and regulate the hyperarousal. The thing is, stress drastically impacts our arousal state. I'm going to show you a slide in a few minutes, so it's going to explain this in more detail. But regulating our energy levels, are like this feeling of being able to get going, this feeling of being able to fully engage and be present, that is being taxed right now in a way that is unusual for anyone. So you add ADHD and you can see where it'd be extra challenging. Many of you have probably heard of the default mode network. It's fascinating. It's an area of growing research. It is a processing network in the brain, and it's best buddies with the task mode network. Now, this is totally going to surprise all of you, I know, but in the neurotypical brain, the default mode network, it's the mind wandering. It's sort of like it's ongoing chatter, or that, that stream of consciousness, the ticker at the bottom of the ESPN, or CNN. And in neurotypical brains, it pauses or shuts off for a bit when someone's engaged in a task, so that the task mode network can do its dance, right? They kind of have a duet. And I know this is going to shock all of you, but with ADHD, that doesn't happen so smoothly, right? They don't do the dance in time. And the default mode network just won't stop. So this is where we get the mind wandering. This is where we get the inattentive mistakes. But the cool thing is, another word for mind wandering is creativity, right? So again, like two sides, same coin. But the default mode network, if it's not like turning off and we're in a space of anxiety, then we can really get ruminative. It's also linked to the hippocampus, which processes memory. So we can maybe ruminate about the past, or that thing we said in the third grade over and over, won't let it go. Or, even just like incessant chatter in the mind, not being able to shut that down. And again, you can see where if you're dealing with the stress of a global pandemic, maybe you're ruminating more, and that inner chatter is even harder to cope with. The next is misperception of time. All of my clients right now are just like, oh my God, will this ever end? Like, what? Every day feels like 5 minutes and 10 years all at once. And that sense you have about time being more fluid for you than your neurotypical peers is true. It's true on a neurological level. There is a different way that the ADHD brain processes time. And, it gets kind of into the complicated neuroscience, but suffice it to say that the ADHD brain also has some difficulty around seeing ourselves in the future and holding the future in like high regard in order to act on it now, right? So like a lot of people with ADHD say, I've never been able to really see myself in the future. Future goals are very abstract for me, and they don't hold much like emotional weight, or they do, but I can't meet the future with the present. So we're stuck in this time vortex when we really literally do not know when this stressor, this trauma is going to end. And then you add misperception of time. You see how, understandably, you might feel a bit disoriented. The ADHD brain craves stimulation. This has to do with that dysregulation of dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter that it's a pleasure chemical. It's a reward chemical. It's a released when we're engaged and stimulated. It's saying yes, keep going. And for people with ADHD, I often hear things like being bored physically hurts. Like it's my body doesn't feel good. It's uncomfortable. Or boredom is a quick slide into depression. And that makes perfect sense, right? Like if your dopamine is crashing, your mood is going to crash too. And if you're someone whose dopamine is not working, as it should, then it's a deeper fall. It's a quicker rise, but it's a deeper fall. So the cool thing about the ADHD brain craving stimulation is also hyperfocus. And some people right now are really finding that to be wonderful coping mechanisms, so that they can hyperfocus on some special interests. Of course, then right, we get into that trouble of like the pseudo productivity, where maybe we're hyper-focused on the really fun, interesting, special interest thing. And, meanwhile, there's a work deadline or what have you. Also, people are seeking out maybe old ways of coping. Snacking. Anyone else? Anyone else with the snacks? This is the virtual space, and I can't see you all, but I have a feeling at least 1 to 3 heads are nodding. A lot of snacking, a lot of using alcohol or video gaming, or just really getting lost in things that produce that dopamine rush right now and getting a little stuck in that. Now would be a great time to fall back on routine, right? Because routine gives us the predictability that the world can't. But if you have ADHD, you probably have a love-hate relationship with it, right? Routine just does not give that sense of satisfaction when you're doing it, but you also probably know it's really good for you. We're at home a lot. I don't know why I feel like I have more dishes now, but I think I have 10,000 more dishes. I don't know where they came from. I know I put them there. I don't know how they piled up, but I feel like there's more stuff. I didn't bring more stuff in, but I'm just more aware, right? I'm home all the time with all this stuff. And then distractibility. God bless you, parents, right now, trying to be teachers, especially if you're someone who has complex kiddos, right? High genetic predisposition there. So that's pretty likely. It's really, really, really hard to be in multiple places at once for anyone. But certainly for someone with ADHD working from home right now, distractions are all over the place. So it's important to give yourself some grace, to recognize that even folks who are neurotypical, for most of them are not at being productive in the same way that they were before. And that's okay. So I'm hoping that running through these 2 slides just validates a little bit of what you're experiencing, kind of calls out and gives some names to what it's like to have ADHD right now. This slide is the one that I really want you to kind of freeze frame in your mind or take a screenshot of, because I find it a really helpful model to help us regulate. And this is the window of tolerance theory. Some of you have maybe heard about stress responses in terms of the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Some of you might have heard of something called polyvagal theory. This really incorporates both. So we'll start with the window of tolerance. And that is our safe and social place. That is the place where we can engage with the world. We feel like we're able to be ourselves. We can problem solve and be creative. We can be present. And what's happening here is that our sympathetic nervous system is not activated, but we're in what's called a ventral vagal state. The vagus nerve runs from the brainstem all the way into the gut. And there's like a down and an up pathway. And basically, like when it's overstimulated, we end up in fight or flight. When it's understimulated, still actually overstimulated, but we can't escape it, it goes into freeze, which looks like understimulation. But when it's just right, like Goldilocks, we're in that ventral vagal state. It might be helpful for you to think of a time when you were there, a time when you felt just kind of content and able to be engaged, just so you can know, what are the cues? What does that feel like for you in your body? Where were you? What helps you get to that space? Now, when we experience stress, we go into this zone of hyperarousal. The ADHD brain also, it really likes to live here because 1, it's stimulating, and 2, we struggle to regulate. We often go into what's called amygdala overload. Our emotion mind literally just floods and the gates start closing. So this is fight or flight. This is when we're nervous, we're irritable, agitated, we're reactive. This is not a good time. Not a good time to problem solve that fight you keep having with your partner. Not a good time. We literally cannot access our reasoning and our executive functioning as well when we're here, because everything in our body is going to fight or flight. Now, when we can't escape the stressor, it just becomes too much. We go into overwhelm. We go down to that blue box, that hypoarousal. It's a dorsal vagal freeze state. And it's really the protective path of last resort. We're very disconnected. You might physically feel very tired or out of it, a little dissociative. People who have experienced trauma might experience this even more profoundly. But I think what I find fascinating, and I think you'll notice here, is that, boy, the ADHD brain sure seems to bounce up and down between these three levels a lot, like even without a global pandemic. But now we're faced with a community trauma that our brains are literally made for. That's what the sympathetic nervous system is here to do, is to be aware of a threat and protect us. And so every day we're kind of, we hear about COVID news, maybe we get a little bit hyper aroused, but we come back down to window of tolerance. But then maybe we get an urgent call from the boss at work, and, being the ADHD we are, we assume that means we've done something wrong and are going to be fired, even if they're calling to give us a raise. And, we get ourselves worked up. But then they find out, they're calling to, praise us. We did a really good job. Back down to the sunny zone, window of tolerance. But then maybe the dog pukes and the kids start tantruming, and, the news comes on again and it's bad. And, your partner starts coming down with a fever. It's too much. You freeze. You just sit down on the couch, you stare into space, and you just think, I can't. That's dorsal vagal shutdown. That is hypoarousal. So that's what's going on on a physiological level and being triggered right now, every day, for everybody. So it's no wonder no one right now is staying in this window of tolerance in this perfectly contained way. But how do we get back to it? How do we create that? So I want to give you some suggestions. And they're not necessarily in any order. And they are some ideas about how you might be able to cope, whether that's with COVID stress, whether that's with your ADHD needs, whether, that's with something else going on in your life. But I want to emphasize there is no perfect way to cope. And so it seems like right now coping with COVID stress in some ways has become this other personal development project on everybody's list, so that we have to, make the gratitude list and go for a walk, and we have to, all of the things. But then it just seems to me there's a lot of messaging around that has this attitude of another form of productivity. It's another rat race. It's another way to self-protect. And that doesn't feel very good to me. So know that there's no perfect way to cope, and please hold yourself with some compassion and validation. My husband said to me the other day, so he's mobilized with the military right now. And, I told him, gosh, I just feel like there are a million, I'm just like that person on the bike at the halftime show with the plates. There's this woman that does a fabulous job at, that I've seen. I think her name is Red Panda. And she's so good with all the plates and all the bowls. And she keeps them all in the air. And I think I speak for most people with ADHD and a lot of women, when I say I feel like sometimes my job is just to keep all the plates in the air. And that if I don't keep them perfectly in the air, they will tumble and crash. And so bad will happen. And so I was talking to my husband about this, and he was like, what if it's okay to let some of the bowls break? What if it's okay to just survive? Just get by. And what if that's your goal? And I tell you, ever since then, it's been a lot easier, because I started to realize that even my idea of coping with what we're going through had become yet another rat race. And it wasn't actually in the service of self-care, right? So it shifted the perspective and it's gotten a lot easier. And I hope that helps some of you or validates some of your experiences too. So while I said that there's no order, really there is kind of an order in that pausing is the first step. Mindfulness is not necessarily meditation. I love this definition by Tara Brach, who wrote the book called Radical Acceptance. And she said mindfulness is a pause. It's the space between stimulus and response. That's where choice lies. And that is absolutely accurate. When we put on the brakes, which the ADHD brain does not automatically do very well, we are able to create this space to regulate so that then we can actually access our reason mind, our wise mind, and come up with some solutions. First, we have to pause. The second step is to create safety, and I highly suggest you pre-plan this. Think about, there's this concept called coping ahead. What does it look like to cope ideally with XYZ situation in the future, whether it's the comparison meltdown, the shame spiral, or just like not keeping up and feeling fight or flight or frozen? How do I cope ideally with that? And the first thing that looks like is to create a sense of safety. So how do I create safety? Have some things in mind. Emotional and mental safety look like taking time and space to regulate. We need about 20 to 30 minutes for our nervous system to, drain the flood on average, sometimes more, and that has to be okay. Remember that right now we're in this space where we can't regulate if we don't feel safe. And yet we're in this space where day in, day out, there's a lot of uncertainty around safety, emotionally and physically, very literally, but also just in terms of the unpredictability, right? There aren't these boundaries. There aren't things to look forward to. There isn't predictability. So taking time and space to regulate right now is super important. Environmental safety, of course, we're assuming here that you have physical safety. Environmental safety, by that, I mean literally creating the space. And maybe that's making a timeout zone for yourself at home. Maybe that's setting boundaries around social media and news. Maybe it looks like, you get away from, the family and you just, so you got to run an errand and you drive and you sit in a park, at a park bench or a parking lot, and you people watch and you listen to a song and you journal or you cry it out or do whatever you have to do to create the physical space. And then relational. Women in particular, there's some research on this tendency to become people pleasers when things get stressful, right? To keep the peace. There's a lot of socialization around that, even now. So it can be hard to set boundaries, but it's super, super important right now. And that might look like telling your kids, your partner, your roommates, hey, if I'm getting stressed, these are the things I'm going to do. That might mean that I go for a walk, and that doesn't mean I'm walking away from you, but I'm actually trying to help us by creating space for myself, for my emotion mind to chill out. The next is name it to tame it. ADHDers have a lot of feelings. And it's really important to understand that the goal is not to get rid of the feelings. The feelings are not bad. They're not right or wrong. I'm hearing lately a lot of I should feel this way or I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't feel so anxious because, I'm so blessed. I have so much good going on for me. I shouldn't feel bad. There's no should when it comes to feelings. Feelings just are. And the more we're able to be with them, the more they move and shift. So you can work on this, increasing emotional awareness by increasing emotional identification. You can use apps, you can use emojis, but practice naming your feelings and then be the observer. Please don't judge what you're feeling. That just makes it so much worse. Here's just some basic ideas for you about some things you can do to regulate. Again, take a picture of this if you want, maybe make your own list. All of these ideas here are based in mind-body practices and somatic experiencing, and they are all some tried and true ways to shift that stress response back into the window of tolerance. Because sometimes we don't even understand why we feel the way we feel, or sometimes our feelings are too big to move directly into this problem-solving space or work on our self-talk. There's a time for that, but it's not always at first. I'm finding, especially with the increased stress of COVID, it's helping a lot of folks to get back to the body. Take a cold shower, do a body scan. I recommend Insight Timer is a free app with tons of wonderful guided relaxations. Some are seated meditations, some are like 2-minute, body scans. Some are prayers, some are just secular and like more little mini lectures on self-care or whatever. It's great. Check that out. When you're doing deep breathing right now, the tendency when we do deep breathing is usually to take a big inhale. But actually, when we want to stimulate the vagus nerve, when we want to get into that, kick in our parasympathetic and get back to that window of tolerance, we actually want to focus on the exhale. So do take a deep breath, but make your exhale as long as possible. 7 to 10 counts if you can. A lot of sensory stuff I found really helpful. Weighted blankets, walking barefoot outside, dancing. I mean, like, is anyone like TikTok right now? I'm just wondering, like, it makes so much sense to me why that feels so good for so many people to get involved with right now. I think I'm seeing more and more people doing the TikTok video dances. Don't worry, I will never do that to you. But it's no wonder, right? Because like it's all about dancing. It's not, there's no argument about anything. There's no news. There's just like silliness and dancing. So connect with pets, loved ones, nature, and seek positive stimulation. Hear a lot of how can I possibly do XYZ, take that time to whatever, paint rocks or do that, the YouTube Zumba video or dance class. I can't do that because I have not yet gotten to the garage or the basement or there are dishes in the sink or whatever. But for ADHD in particular, it is essential that you are keeping up with your positive stimulation that keeps your dopamine flowing in better ways. Got a few more here, and then we're going to get into Q&A. What is the essence of the thing you think you want? This is excellent for when you find yourself in comparison mode, when you find yourself really struggling with the should. Perhaps you're stuck in, I'm supposed to, I should be tidying up the house. I want this great minimalist space. I want to Marie Kondo everything. And that just really appeals to me. Okay. Why? What is the experience underneath the tidy house that you want? Is it the tidy house or is it clarity, peace and quiet, more space for yourself? What is the essence of the thing you think you want? Maybe that does mean getting a professional organizer, to give you some input or straightening up a few things. But maybe you do that with an attitude of fun, put on a song and make it a game. Or maybe the space you need just looks like going to your room, shutting the door and taking a 10-minute nap in the middle of the day or a half-hour nap in the middle of the day, giving yourself that permission. So how can you experience the essence of the thing you think you want in a way that's small, realistic, and true for you? You can also take a look at your values and have that guide your decisions. Shift the should to could, because could creates room for choice. When in doubt, start with what is the next right action? Slow it down. This is really helpful for people with ADHD because we tend to be so externally focused. Again, we tend to be thinking along the lines of, okay, what do I need to do to pass? What do I need to do so they approve of me? How can I be good enough today? And that might not be a conscious thought, but it's always there. Like, how do I live up to this standard? Right? Back to my very first slide. It's always there. And the antidote to this is turning inwards. So we're living from the inside out. ADHDers are great at living, from the outside in, all the things. We notice all the things, and that's great. But we need to start within. How do I want to show up? And the last piece is just attuning to yourself. These are just this is a nice alliterative way to outline a few ADHD needs. But I think the bigger point here is attunement, because as someone who is neurodivergent, we are always experiencing these moments of misattunement with the world around us and even our loved ones, where there's misunderstandings or breaks in connection. And so we start to heal that by tuning to ourselves, by not recreating the neglect that many of us experienced, or rejection and judgment many of us experience elsewhere in our lives, right? So it's turning towards, and here are just a few ideas. Success, set yourself up for success, get some support, create some small flexible routines, and take breaks. And to end, this is a quote I love, because I think it's important that we let this time impact us, that we let hardship impact us, that we sit with that and allow ourselves to not do it perfectly, because that's how we learn to trust ourselves and we learn we are strong. So the quote is, let difficulty transform you, and it will. In my experience, we just need help in learning how not to run away. Pema Chodron. So we now will open it up for Q&A.
That was excellent, Michelle. Really. So insightful.
Thank you.
And a lot of questions as a result of it. One woman is asking, I want to stop trying to fit into the neurotypical mold, but my therapist insists this would be a quote-unquote bad idea. What should I do? I'm 60 years old and tired of faking it.
I guess my question is, what does it mean to you to not fit the mold, and what does she mean by bad idea? I do find that there are clinicians out there who sort of collude with this idea of needing to be fixed, and they take their cues from you. So they might even, try to bring in the planner and do the time management, because that's sort of maybe the anxiety you're bringing and putting out, and then they want to help you. And so they sort of collude with this idea of finding the way to pass. And I do think it's a dance, right? Like, if breaking the mold means just being more of yourself, but that's still in a way where you're functional, then that's different than I'm going to break the mold and I'm like completely going to go off grid with no plan and no social support. And, so obviously it really depends what you mean. But I would really ask her, I'd be really, really curious, what makes you think that? What are your fears from you? What are your concerns? Perhaps you two have some different meanings and you're assuming you're talking about the same thing, but you're not. That's my thought.
Uh-huh. A lot of questions, I should say several, on polite responses, or maybe but effective responses to people who are constantly shooting people with ADHD. I mean, is there a constructive response that doesn't make, other than just sort of blowing up and getting angry?
I think it depends on exactly what is said, how I might phrase a response. But, obviously, like, if you need, take a moment to take yourself out of the scenario to regulate. Because again, remember, like, if we feel too much fire in our belly, we don't say the things we really want to say. and then we regret that later. So pausing for a moment. And what I found to be helpful is to get curious. Like, what is that other person so afraid of? What does that other person think it means if you do this in this certain way? Like, there's a meaning they attribute to that is good because, and maybe there's a better understanding you can come to. I've often found, like, even with myself, sometimes I have one thought in my mind, or actually more like, 100, but I don't always communicate all of the steps I took to get to the end action or choice, right? Like, I don't always verbalize that. And I might take this really roundabout way of getting to where I'm going with a decision or something. And so I found it helpful to say to people, okay, well, here's the way I'm thinking about this. Here's where my mind went, and break it down. Because sometimes with ADHD, our thoughts go so fast, we skip a million steps. And sometimes there is a disconnection or a misunderstanding in there around what it is we mean or are doing. Some people might be trying to make things okay for us. They might be saying, well, I thought you wanted me to, be an accountability partner. It's important that we tell people how to attune to us, what we need, what support looks like, and not just assume that they know. So get underneath what the should means and what are they trying to get at the should. Are they trying to be supportive? Are they trying to, hold you accountable? Do you just have different worldviews? There's a lot that could be going on there, but when you bring them into conversation around the underlying meaning, and then you explain your reasoning, your needs, and your boundaries, you might be able to find some wiggle room in there.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, if someone's really just doesn't give you room to have differences, that's not, at the end of the day, that's not a healthy relationship. Healthy relationships make room for difference. They make room for challenges and meanings and disagreements. So I know a lot of people with ADHD often find themselves sort of stuck in these toxic scenarios, maybe because someone seems to have it so together, so they seem like, they'd be a good partner or friend, but then that person maybe kind of takes a little bit advantage of some vulnerability, and then so there's a lot going on there. It also urges you to make sure that you're setting your boundaries.
Right. This woman began menopause at the beginning of this year, and now she's contending with menopause, ADHD, and the pandemic. She's wondering, trying to make her way through this. Any thoughts about menopause and the ADHD brain?
What a year. What a year for you, that's right. Is it like, are you like, you've got to also be wondering, am I having like a hormonal symptom, or, am I getting the COVID? I feel like everyone's like, is it allergies, or am I getting sick all of a sudden too? So there's a lot of like anxiety around body right now on top of it. Right. Yeah. So it's important to know we're still learning a lot, historically, there's obviously women have clearly been left out of the medical literature. Hormones are really hard to study. That doesn't make it okay that, they haven't done more. They're working on it. But what we do know is that dopamine and estrogen are linked. And so estrogen upregulates dopamine. So when we have drops in estrogen, we have drops in dopamine. And so that's why every woman has like the menopause brain, kind of the brain fog. Every woman has some loss of that. But certainly if you're someone with ADHD who is already like working at, 50% of 100, your drop takes you below 0. So normalizing that, talking to your physicians, seeing if you can get them to connect and consult. I think giving yourself just a lot of grace and a lot of space to explore what it looks like for you to live well in this new body, in this new time. And set a lot of boundaries around a need to maybe slow down and go inward and figure it out, because what one woman needs is different than the other. You often need to maybe like re-up all of your strategies, because what worked before might not work now. So that might look like getting a coach or a therapist and like redesigning your coping skills box, basically. You know, what's your toolbox look like now? Understanding it's going to be different is key.
Right. Another woman has, how do I break out of dorsal vagal shutdown? It can be so bad that I freak out and literally fall asleep from the stress.
Yeah. So any of those, like on the page that had regulate on the slide, I think you can get copies of the slide, right, Wayne?
Yes, I can download the slide, yes.
Okay, good. So on that page, there were several things that will help. It can be easier to know what to do when you're in fight or flight, because it's like, okay, we're often, like from a young age, we're really told how to do that, how to, take 5 and, take a time out, like calm down. But when we need to actually like sort of go the opposite way and rev up a bit, create more energy, it's hard to know how to do that. Oftentimes it does look like doing some of those grounding exercises where you get back in your body, where you create a feeling of safety, being present, right? So like where's the space you can go to where you feel you can, be in the present moment. Use sensory exercises to help like be in the moment. I really like, name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. Maybe make a cup of tea and do that. Take a cold shower. Things like swaying in place, or just like kind of doing like getting the wiggles out. I don't know if you've seen those like kid yoga shows, stuff like that. But play around with it. Be curious. Like be curious about your body. Be, an observer. It will let you know. Try a bunch of stuff and see what works. There's no right answer. It's what works for you.
Right. This one, I hope it's not too large, because we only have a question, because we only have a couple minutes left.
Okay.
But how does a woman with ADD move past the paralyzed overwhelm? She's feeling literally stuck in the bedroom during these stay-at-home days, while now watching all the productivity around me. Someone tells me to take a bath. It's well-meaning, but I feel like it's in order. How does she wants to know how to get her brain started, because her brain doesn't come online until the middle of the afternoon, and then she's into supper and sleep. So, so I guess overall, let's get moving somehow, or try to find motivation.
I think, well, yes, and the ADHD brain doesn't experience motivation the same way. It can't really be counted on. So it's more, okay, how do I act? Like, how do I, kind of do it anyway? Like, how do I create a shift in myself in this moment? You might need to, do a quick deep breathing, just like whatever you can do sensorily to get present in the moment and just take a breather before you can activate. But then try some things that might be a little bit activating. Maybe just a change of space, open a window and the blinds, put on a song. Like, think in terms of how can I create a shift in my energy, a shift in my body sensations right now. Maybe that starts with just paying attention to them. Oftentimes when we're in that state, we start disconnecting even from ourselves and numbing out. So it can be helpful to bring your attention to your body. That like progressive muscle relaxation, you tense up your fists, you make them into balls, tense, and then relax, and you notice the difference. Something like that. Hold ice cubes, like something that will bring you into the present. And then you might have the space to sit down and say, okay, what is the one thing I want to do today that would feel good for me? And break that down as much as you can. But you're having trouble bridging from right now to using the strategies that probably like have helped you in the past. So you got to create a bridge to be able to say, okay, now from what I know of all the skills and strategies that help ADHD, which is going to help me right now. But you might need to create some activation first, like we were saying. But I also acknowledge that like it's just going to look different. And when you give yourself permission for it not to be ideal or perfect, I found that also creates more space for it to be good.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yes, I like that strategy. Well, I think the hour is up, Michelle. It was excellent.
All right.
Really excellent.
Good. I hope this was helpful.
I think it was based on the comments I'm seeing here. So
good.
Thanks for being here and sharing your expertise. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Okay.
All right, everyone. Stay well.
And thanks for the attendees for listening in. Please join us on May 19th when Mark Walrach and Joseph Hagen will talk about understanding the new ADHD guidelines for diagnosing and treating children. Thanks, everybody, for being here, and have a great day. Bye-bye.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.